Okay, so before we finish off some of the ballistic skills, anybody have any questions on the earlier skills that we covered, or the observation plans, or anything like that? Okay, and then I have to apologize. I've been struggling with getting last week's playground film up, but I think I've sorted it out. So last week's playground film and this week's playground film should be available this afternoon. I probably will not include them in the midterm grades since I'm so late sorting out how to load the film. Right? That's for lab, by the way. Okay, so let's get this finished. So remember that we were looking at ballistic skills as a group. Although the skills look different, the mechanical principles are very similar, right? We have to apply a force to an object to project that object to point B, all right? So proficiency often means maximum force and speed, not always. Remember that we looked at the difference between asking an individual to throw for distance or force, or throwing for accuracy, and that by changing that task constraint, we see a very, very different motor pattern emerge, right? They're not going to be automatic, these skills. They need to be modeled, they need to be taught, right? And that an active older adult is going to be able to maintain the pattern if they practiced it and were proficient at it when they were younger, especially if they've carried on with using that skill as they got older. Right? So all the time be thinking about our constraints triangle. What are our individual constraints? What are our environmental constraints? What are our task constraints that are interacting to see the emerging movement? Right? So the next skill, I skipped punting. Please make sure to look at punting. Right? There isn't time to cover every skill. But punting is the same idea as you'll see when you look at the book. Right? So sidearm striking, we're looking at a skill that would be the foundation for maybe a tennis forehand or backhand, or a baseball, softball strike, some cricket strikes, although a lot of cricket shots are under swing rather than a side swing. We can use an implement, or we can use our hands. So often if you're working with someone who's struggling with this skill, you can use a balloon or a very soft light ball and work on that with a hand strike before you add an implement, so that their eye-hand coordination maybe improves. Okay. So early sidearm striking looks very similar to early throwing. All right. So what we see is a chop. Remember that stage one of throwing is that chop down type action with no foot movement. We're going to see a similar scenario here. There might be a little bit of leg or trunk, but typically not to begin with. You can do this as a ball on a tee or a ball on a cone. In this instance, they've done a ball hanging on a string. I've done that with a balloon, hung the balloon from a string, and then tie the strings onto the swing set, and the kids really enjoy that. So let's have a look at what this is going to look like, this stage, early stage of striking. There we go. So it looks very much like our early throwing. Can you see that? Does that make sense? Looks like he's enjoying it though, which is the key. So as we get more proficient, all right, at swinging, then we're going to start seeing possibly a step. Typically at the fundamental level, you would expect to see a step in opposition, although if you watch really, really top-class tennis players, that step, kind of flat swing, is not as typical anymore as it used to be 30, 40 years ago, right? A lot of tennis players take an open stance and use a lot of top spin now. So as you get more advanced, the shots start to look a little bit more different. But here we've got a more efficient pattern occurring. So we can see he's got some trunk rotation and hip rotation now. If the ball had been coming towards him, he may have taken a step. You can see his side on here to the ball, right? So this is much more useful. We've got a longer swing, so we're able to apply more force. We're adding in trunk rotation as well. So mechanically, this is much more efficient. So as I said, and they've got an adult here, but certainly at the fundamental level, what we're looking for is a step in opposition to be side on to the ball. And once you've got that, then you can start tweaking, right, and changing it for different sports. Remember, we're looking at a fundamental foundation that we need to reach competency at in order to then be able to teach other sports skills, right? So if I want to teach baseball or I want to teach tennis, I need that fundamental level of striking first, right? So typically a horizontal swing, same idea with the arm, all right, as we had previously in chapter 3, that as we make contact, we really want to be have the longest radius possible to add the most power. All right. I watch a lot of world-class tennis, and I would say that not everybody extends their arm before they hit the ball, but they create power by adding top spin and using their body and their legs more, right? When we get to overarm striking, that's a little bit different. Okay. So if we think about our developmental sequence charts, right, then if you look at page 118, then they've got the foot, trunk, and upper arm. You could use the throwing table and the throwing observation plan. All right? So the foot and the trunk in particular, very, very similar to fundamental overarm throwing. Okay? So what we want to encourage is the use of the trunk and the hips as well. Right? Can we get them to swing hard enough that we get some shoulder rotation and some trunk rotation? Right? And gradually, as they're getting more proficient, we're going to see the bat and the arm go from chopping down on the ball to gradually coming sideways to the ball. Okay? Oops. Now, the grip isn't one of the components exactly, right? So the grip on the racket isn't a component that we're going to be scoring. But what you would expect to see is that initially the grip is going to be a very power grip, and then it's going to become more of a kind of shaking hands type grip. Depending on, so the grip is an interesting constraint because it depends on the size of the handle of whatever implement the child is using, right? It's not quite so dramatic when you look at older teenagers and adults, but when you look at younger children, if you give them something that's got a very fat handle on it, then you're going to see a different holding pattern, grip pattern, than if you give them something with a thinner handle, right? And if you look at page 119, then they've got the observation plan for the one component that you can't use throwing for. All right, so that's the racket bat action. So what's happening, so it's kind of linked with what's happening from the elbow to the wrist and what's happening with the hand, but they're looking at the bat action. All right, so we have, is the racket swung in a horizontal plane? Yes or no? Right, so again, very easy yes, no type questions. You only want there to be two options in answer to any question that you ask. All right? So if it's no, then we're seeing more of a chop action. If it's yes, then we've got to look at, so then what is happening? So what they're interested in then is, are we seeing some lag in the racket? And remember when we looked at throwing, we said that that forearm lag allows for more power on the ball because I'm able to apply force for longer. So similar idea with paddle, racket, bat, whatever, is that if we get some lag, so the bat is behind the wrist and the elbow, then we can add more power to the ball. All right? Any questions about sidearm striking? Remember to keep looking at the sequences, keep looking at the observation plans, because you've got an observation plan to create coming up. Okay? So you need to make sure that you really understand that concept so that you can do a super job on your own. Okay? All right, overarm striking then. So we're looking at this action, right? So, a volleyball serve or a tennis serve, very, very similar in action when they're done well, okay? So on an overarm strike, we really are looking for as big a reach as possible when we make contact with the ball, right? So early overarm striking, it's not on either the MSU chart or on the TGMD, but we do have a little bit of information about how we expect the development of overarm striking to look like. All right, so not a lot of trunk rotation, so I'm going to be kind of face on to the direction that I'm expecting the ball to go. We swing at the ball with the kind of floppy elbow and not really enough lag, and it kind of looks a little bit like early throwing again. All right, so there's not the turn, there's not the reach, okay? It's kind of floppy. More practice, more experience, then we become more competent at the skill. We start to see rotation of the trunk. Right? We'll start to have a slightly more extended arm as we're beginning to swing it forwards. And then as we make contact, everything is going to be as stretched and long as possible. Again, we're looking at that principle that we had in chapter 3 that said we want the longest radius, right, of rotation at the point of contact with the ball, right? So we're seeing something that is much more sequential, lag, 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 reach, hit the ball, right? So they have created a developmental sequence for overarm striking. They don't exactly turn that sequence yet into a complete observation plan, but again that's because some of these components are similar to throwing. All right, so we've got a developmental sequence which is useful, I think, since we don't have this skill on the other assessment tools that we've used, all right? So the components that they're looking at, trunk, arm, leg sequences, very similar to throwing, all right? So no trunk rotation initially, some trunk rotation, and then we're expecting complete trunk rotation as a competent level for that component. Okay. Then I think the next couple of components for me are a little more interesting to look for. What's happening with the elbow as we make contact with the ball, all right? So we've got lots of variability going on with the angle at the elbow to begin with, right? And then we're getting a much more extended angle as we get more and more competent, all right? Same with spine and pelvis rotation. So we end up with very little rotation to begin with, and then we're getting lots of rotation when we're more proficient, all right? It's all aimed at adding more power to the ball. Okay. And then they have a component of the racket action again, as they did for sidearm striking. So, and they're looking at the idea of the lag on the racket, as we did with the arm lag on the throwing component. All right? If there's some lag, then I'm adding more force to the racket, which gets transferred to the ball. Right? So, you've got to be a little thoughtful when you're thinking about what is applying the force with this skill. Right? If it's a volleyball serve, then the person is applying the force to the ball. Right? If it's a tennis serve, the person is applying force to the racket, and the racket is applying force to the ball. Okay? Okay, let me have a quick look at this new edition and see if they kept this in. Okay. So this, it's a little bit weird, this title, because it's not overarm striking. So there's very little data at the moment on older adults and what happens with the developmental sequence for overarm striking or any kind of striking with older adults. Now, from a lifetime skill perspective, both tennis and golf are skills that older adults maintain and use for physical activity and recreation, and they're both ballistic type skills. So the tennis, we don't have a lot of data on. Actually, neither of them we have a lot of data on. There is a little bit of data on golfing, not very much. Okay, so really I think we don't have like developmental sequences, we don't have a projected expectation of what these shots are going to continue to look like. The key point, I think, when you're considering older adults and these striking type skills is go back to what are the rate limiters going to be? What does our constraints triangle tell us about what we might see happen with striking skills in older adults? All right? So striking skills very much dependent upon range of motion at the shoulder. So if we see some arthritis or just some loss of flexibility in the shoulder, then that would impact what we see as a motor pattern, right, emerge. Okay. What other rate controllers, rate limiters might play a role? So if I lose some strength, right, we've said that it's typical that as we get older, we start to lose some muscle mass, and therefore we lose some strength. So that might change what we see happen. Okay. I find already that when I play tennis, I have some pain in my elbow if I keep my arms straight, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I want to add force to the ball, that means I should hit the ball with a straight arm. But when I hit the ball with a straight arm, it hurts in my elbow. So I find myself now kind of hitting, that means I have to get closer to the ball, right? But I find myself hitting more with a bent arm because that doesn't cause me any pain, right? But that means I have to be a little more aware and a little more proactive with my anticipation of where the ball is going to be so that I can move there a little bit quicker. And so what we see often with older adults, particularly in tennis, when I watch older adults play tennis, I don't know very much about golf, I have to say, but when I watch older adults play tennis, what I see is, even though they're slower than the younger people, their understanding of where the ball is going to go on the court, because they've been playing for a long time, is very good. And so they often reach balls that I would think they wouldn't be able to get to because they start moving early. They anticipate what's going to happen and they can get to the right position in time. Right? Golf's going to be a little bit different because obviously you're in control of the ball all the time. It's not the same as tennis where you're receiving balls from another person, right? The strategy in golf is more about, you know, how hard, what kind of club, what direction, right? You don't have to deal with constraints from another person like topspin or backspin or speed on the ball, right? So in golf, we see pretty good maintenance of accuracy. In one of the very few older adult tennis type studies, then what they found was it depended on the level of experience of the individuals. So people who had been tennis players when they were young, or even teaching professionals at a tennis club, had higher levels of skill as they got older. It's kind of not rocket science, right? But they also found that the people who hadn't had as much experience could improve with practice, right? So what's the best way to assess these ballistic skills, all right? We want to be able to use these developmental sequences, right, as a checklist. So that's why the observation plan is useful, because to read all the detail in the developmental sequence table and score it at the same time is very hard, right? So even on film, that's difficult. So if we have those yes/no questions in the observation plan, that makes a checklist much easier to manage, okay? The suggestion is that if we see the answer to the question more often than not, then we give them that yes, right? So it's a little bit different to how we grade our TGMD, which is, do I see it? Yes, it's a 1. Do I see it? No, it's a 0, right? So here what they're suggesting with the observation plan is that you give people a little bit more opportunities, so you give them more attempts at the skill, and then if you see it, it needs to be probably an odd number of attempts, otherwise you could end up, if you do an even number, you could end up with the same number of yeses and nos. Okay? So you want an odd number of attempts at the skill, and if you see the characteristic more often than not, then you give them the yes. Alright? Remember that we need to be at right angles to the plane of motion. So if I'm looking from the side, I'm looking for the length of the step. I'm looking for the trunk twist. I'm looking to see if there's lag occurring. If I'm looking at the back, I can see where the arm is in relation to the direction of force application. Does that make sense? So to pull it together then, we're looking at developmental sequences that are geared to creating a more competent, effective biomechanical pattern for force application to the implement that we're projecting, right? So for each type of skill, again, that's very similar. You know, we want a bigger step forwards, we want more trunk rotation, right? We might want some segmentation of that rotation. We want more and more lag on the limb that is doing the projecting, right? Whether it's the kick, whether it's the leg or whether it's the arm, right? And without a lot of practice, a lot of modeling, and very good feedback and teaching cues, not everyone is going to reach competency in these types of skills, right? They are not hardwired. They're very much based on experience, practice, and teaching, okay? And if we stay active, right, and we stay healthy, then the coordination and the ability to maintain these skills seems to be relatively stable across time. Okay. So ballistic skills are interesting from a lifespan, lifestyle, physical activity point of view because they're very much involved in the kinds of physical activity that we're motivated to do as we get older, that we find fun, right? That provide a social environment for us to engage in as we get older. So joining a tennis club, when you retire, or a golf club, right? You're not going to go and join a football team, right, in your 60s and 70s. Okay? You might throw the ball in the yard or at the park with your children or your grandchildren, but you're not going to play football. Same with my sport, right? I might still do handstands and cartwheels, but I don't do gymnastics anymore, right? So a lot of the skills that we do or sports that we take part in are not sports that we can maintain our physical activity with as we get older, right? So these ballistic skills are really important. If we can get more children competent in these skills, we're providing them that foundation to maintain physical activity as they get older. Okay? Questions? No questions? Okay, make sure that you take a look at these observation plans, right? Go have a look at what's coming from an assignment point of view. And on Thursday, we will start the next chapter, which is about manipulation skills. So catching, for example, driving a car. Okay? The manipulation skills are not as mechanically technical quite often, but they involve a lot of perception and anticipation, and that makes them very complicated. So we typically see the development of manipulation skills later than the development of ballistic skills. Right? Okay. I will see you on Thursday.